All right, today we're going to move on to looking at different denominational beginnings in America. Where did some of the churches come from? How did they develop? You were to have read some pages and taken notes on this for today. The first church under consideration in your notes is Anglicanism, and there's nothing really more for me to say than what is in your book. You have a little bit about the beginnings of it. The two most important people are Blair and Bray. You have something about those in your notes, and then a little something about the expansion of Anglicanism in America. And it's called Anglicanism because it is the English church, the Church of England. Anglicanism or the Anglican Church is the same thing. Now, after the War of Independence, it was unpopular to call anything English, and so the Anglican Church in America started to be called the Episcopalian Church. And so that's why we have the Episcopalian Church in America, but still part of the worldwide Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Okay, so we're going to move from there to looking at the English separatist denominations.
It flipped back to your background for a second there. And I lost it to the back.
Okay, because I clicked on the wrong. For some reason, when I do this, let's see if that works. Yeah, okay. Sometimes on the bottom of my screen, it has three different choices that look like the same thing, and if I click on the wrong one, then it doesn't work. Okay, so enough about that. We're looking at the English separatist denominations in America, and we'll begin with the Baptist. Separatist, of course, means that they are churches that began in separation from the Church of England. The Baptists trace their history in America back to Roger Williams, who we have looked at previously. In 1639, Roger Williams and another man baptized each other, and then 10 others to form the first Baptist church in America. The Baptists were under persecution in America, just like they were in Europe and England. Not as badly, because there were places they could go, as we see Roger Williams going to Rhode Island. One of the most famous incidents of the persecution of colonial Baptists occurred in Massachusetts. In 1651, authorities arrested two Baptists from Rhode Island by the name of John Clark and Obadiah Holmes. They were arrested for holding an illegal Baptist service in a private home. Remember, in Massachusetts, there is a state church. There is a church which is a part of the state government, and that's the one you have to go to. They didn't allow religious liberty to have other churches. And so these people were meeting in a private home. These two guys were arrested. Clark was freed after a friend paid his fine, but Holmes refused to pay or to allow it to be paid by someone else. He insisted on taking his punishment as kind of a statement about the authorities there in Massachusetts. And so the Massachusetts authorities gave him 39 lashes with a whip in Boston Common. That was his penalty for conducting a Baptist meeting in a private home. Well, the Baptists were not well received, as you can imagine. So Rhode Island became a place for many of them to go. As we look at the Baptists, there are certain distinctive beliefs that the Baptists held to that were at variance with the other denominations, especially those that were connected with states or governments. The first belief that is a distinction of Baptists is that there was baptism of confessing believers only by immersion. So there are two things here that were distinctive from the other churches coming out of the Reformation, or the Roman Catholic Church as well, and that is that only professing believers were baptized, not babies, and that it had to be by immersion, and not by pouring or sprinkling water on a person. All right, so two parts really to that one, but it has to do with baptism, and that's why they're called Baptists, because of that distinction. All right, any question about that first belief? I think you're all familiar with that probably. How many of you go to a church in which believers' baptism by immersion is practiced? Okay, so most of you. The second belief is congregational polity. Now, we've talked about polity before. What does that mean, congregational polity? I'm talking about politics. Remember what polity means? We spent part of a class on church polity. What is polity? What is the congregational polity, Devin?
It's how the leaders are elected and what leaders are in the church.
In the church, all right. That's what polity is. What is congregational polity? Well, Hani, I'm going to try again. Right. So it's the congregation that decides, and each church is autonomous. Each church runs its own affairs. There's no one, other organization or any hierarchy of a denomination telling them what to do. Each church runs its own and elects its own leaders. All right, that's congregational polity. They did restrict church membership to the regenerate. In other words, those who profess faith in Christ or were baptized would be eligible for membership. How is that different than other churches? Well, you have in the congregational church, their members, at least sort of members, from the time that they're baptized as children, and then they become full members later on. And other churches had varying degrees of who was considered a member and who was not. But for the Baptists, you had to profess evidence that you were regenerate, that is, that you had been made alive by the Holy Spirit. The fourth distinctive of the Baptists was a separation of church and state. Now, once again, I've explained this before, they did not mean by that the same thing that people mean today when they talk about separation of church and state. What they meant by that was that the state government, the whatever government there was not in charge of the church. You know, the church and the state were not linked together that way. It's not to say that there couldn't be religious things in the government, that there couldn't be religious expressions in the government, that you couldn't talk about God in the government, that you couldn't have an influence of the church or churches upon the government, which is what people mean today, that you can't have any of that. That's not what was in mind at all. It simply meant that the church government and the state government are separate entities. They're not entwined together. All right, any questions about the beliefs of the Baptists? All right, how many of you go to a church that's called Baptist? All right, a couple of you. How many of you go to a church which seems to embrace these ideas we would call Baptistic in a way, because they embrace these ideas? Okay. The next group we're going to talk about are the Quakers. The Quakers were started by an Englishman by the name of George Fox. Their beliefs were very different than even the Baptists. And here they are. First of all, Fox taught that we receive guidance by an inner light, which is an illumination from God found in every man. So every person born has this inner light from God. Depending on how people talk about it within the Quakers, it's either the indwelling Holy Spirit or it's some spark of divinity that's within each person, which brings salvation through obeying its leading. So salvation comes by obeying the inner light rather than Christ's atonement. So salvation is not based upon the death of Christ. Salvation is based upon you following this inner light. Any questions? Now, most of them also opposed participation in war. They opposed taking oaths. You know, for example, in a court of law, you know, where you put your hand on the Bible and say, "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God." They would say, "No, can't do that," because Jesus said, "Don't take an oath." And they opposed holding political office. They believed that they should not be involved in politics, in government. All right, so these are the things they opposed. Fighting, taking oaths, or politicking. Any questions? Yeah.
Well, like, I was doing a project, and most of my ancestors on my dad's side are like all Quaker, and my one like great grandpa was a conscientious objector, but he was forced to be in the army because like that wasn't allowed. And he was in Sherman's March to the Sea, and there's like this legend that like his commanding officer strapped a gun to his back and made him march, but he never fired a shot.
No, that sounds like a Quaker kind of thing to do. Even beginning with the War for Independence, Quakers would not fight, but they would help with medical attention. They would work in hospitals. They would go out in the field maybe and help people. They just wouldn't fight. And that continues on till to today, I believe. There's still Quakers that are, and others that are conscientious objectors to fighting, can still be involved in other ways. He's got the new message. Okay. Any other comments about the beliefs of the Quakers? Now, some of you may be wondering, and some of you know, the Friends denomination is an offshoot of the Quakers, and we may talk about that later. But if you go to a Friends church, okay, this is not what you believe today, right? Would you say you fit more in the Baptistic realm, probably, yeah. But the origin of Friends is the Quakers. In fact, they called it, as comes from the fact that they called each other friend rather than by titles, like, you know, Sir and Mr. Everyone was a friend. Yes.
Is the Quaker meeting house in Salem, is it called the Friends meeting house because it's like part of the Friends Quaker thing, or is it just that that's what it's called?
Okay. Are you telling me that it is called the Friends Meeting House?
So,
I'm not sure what the name of it is, because sometimes signs telling people what something is and the actual sign on the building may be something different. No, I don't know. There's also a Quaker Meeting House in, I guess it's considered Middleton, on Crestview Road, I think it is. There's a small building there. I'm not sure if it's still used or not. All right, any other questions? By the way, if you're interested, a guy that I knew many years ago that I taught with was a conservative Quaker in modern times, and he wrote a manual. I'm trying to spot it with my eyes as I'm talking about it. It's a black bound manual with rings holding it together, a manual of discipline. So if you're interested in reading what the Quakers' practices are, that might be a good source. He eventually got kicked out because he has violated some of their strict standards. But when I taught with him, he wouldn't wear a tie, wouldn't wear a watch, any jewelry, had to dress very plainly. Now he has a store up on Route 224, let's see, west of Canfield. Can't think what's the name of that little community there. But it's a little store. It's like it looks like a little Indian trading post, and he paints, sculpts all kinds of Indian stuff. Last time I saw him, he even had a mohawk, even though he's Irish. Very smart guy. All right, so that's the Quaker beliefs. Now let's go to their worship, if you want to call the meeting together. Their worship was extremely plain. this is what they would do. They would come and sit in silence. How many of you would have a hard time doing that? Sitting in silence, yeah. I think more should have their hands up, I think. And basically they're waiting for the inner light to move someone to speak. So you sit there until your inner light says to you, you should say something. So they have no regular ministers, no one that's in charge of teaching the word or anything like that. And you sit there and wait for the inner light. And so there are no church ordinances either. So they do not have baptism or communion, anything associated normally with the church, the operation of the church. All right, any questions? All right, next, persecution. You can imagine if the Baptists were persecuted, the Quakers even more so. They were arrested and deported by Puritans in New England. Between 1659 and 1661, 4 of them were hung for returning after repeated warnings not to come into that area, preaching their ideas. And eventually we get to 3 different tendencies among the Quakers. So we have the tendency of being mystical. They essentially rejected the Bible as revelation and instead claimed they received direct revelation from God. So in the inner light thing would be how they received instruction from God, not by reading the Bible. They were moralists in that they emphasized good works, doing good for one another, for other people. That was one branch. So what happens is these emphases develop into different branches of Quakerism. So there are those that are just concerned with mystical experiences. There are those that emphasize mostly, okay, we need to be about good works. And then there was a third emphasis that was biblical, and that is that they began to emphasize the biblical authority and that atonement didn't come through following the inner light, it came through Christ. And this would be the branch that eventually ends up being called Friends. This branch, the moralists, became more interested in the social gospel, that is, in emphasizing works and not really being concerned about relationship with Christ, and be, more modern times, anti-war protesting and efforts to get food to people that need it, so all kinds of good works like that. These people would be similar to New Age, just the New Age movement or cosmic humanism, just looking to experience something spiritual. All right, any questions about that then? These distinguishing tendencies eventually separate the Quakers into some different groups. Okay, do we have any Quakers? Just thought I'd ask. I can kind of tell by looking at you that you're not. Just like I can tell you're not on machine. All right, the next group we're going to look at are a little more mainstream, and that's the Presbyterians. How many of you are Presbyterian? Okay. Hey, what church do you go to?
It's called Western Presbyterian.
Western?
Westfield.
Westfield. Where's that?
Mount Jackson.
Oh, okay, over in Pennsylvania. All right. Francis McKemmy is the one who really helps establish the Presbyterian Church in America. Presbyterianism is basically what's called the churches that follow Calvin and the way he organized the church there in Geneva, Switzerland. McKemmy came in 1683 to evangelize and to plant churches. and he persuaded colonial courts to recognize the English Parliament's Act of Toleration, which was in 1689, guaranteeing freedom of worship. So in other words, as he was going around, a lot of the colonial governments did not want Presbyterianism established because they had their own state churches. But when England passed this Act of Toleration, he used that to say to the colonial courts, legislatures and courts, especially as he'd be brought into court, for violating the law, he would say, look, this act in England applies here too. You have to allow us to worship, even though we're not the state church. The beliefs of the Presbyterians established by McKinney were doctrinally. They followed Tulip as well. Who can recite Tulip for me? By the way, I should say you guys did very well with that on the last test. Most of you had it all, which distinguishes you from some previous classes who acted like they'd never heard that before. So anybody can recite it? Unlimited. Wait a minute.
Unconditional.
No, not unlimited. No, that's worth for nothing. What unconditional election? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Right. Okay. You got it. So they believe doctrinally the same as the Puritans, the Congregationalists, but their polity was different in that it was Presbyterian. So they had elders. Not that much different, really, from the Congregationalists. But the Congregationalists had the state church in much of New England. All right, and that's basically what we're going to say about the Presbyterians. Stephen?
Were they genuinely Calvinists or genuinely?
Originally, the Presbyterians were Calvinists, yeah, which would be the Tulip. It's not until mostly the early 20th century that Presbyterians start departing, become more Arminian in their doctrine. Some of them very liberal in their theology, so that you have Presbyterian church denominations today that don't believe a lot of the Bible, don't believe in miracles, don't believe what's in the Bible. In fact, it's interesting, R.C. Sproul, who just died this past year, was a Presbyterian, and when he was ordained in the Presbyterian church, he stated, and what was normal for most of the Presbyterian church history is that you would agree with the Westminster Confession of Faith, he stated that, and the people that were ordaining him almost didn't ordain him because he believed what supposedly the church said they believed. So the leaders in the Presbyterian church in that area in western Pennsylvania took issue with his belief in what was the official doctrine of the church they had departed from. Any other questions about the Presbyterians? Okay, we're going to stop there for today, and tomorrow we'll look at the continental denominations, that is, denominations that came from the continent of Europe, tomorrow. And with that in mind, I want you to read and take notes on pages 72 to 76. Pages 72 to 76, read and take notes as you go.